Hi, everyone. Welcome to our two-part webinar series on building and managing and nurturing a board for last mile distributors. We'll get started now. I think we have a good audience today. This is the part two of our two-part series that is co-hosted by Global Distributors Collective and Care Social Ventures. I'm Zubaida Bai, the founder of Care Social Ventures and the managing director right now. And we will get started today by kicking off with a quick agenda. I request all of you to keep your videos on if possible and mute yourself so that we can reduce some background noise here. From a setting the agenda perspective, I think we will start today with a quick introduction and context of the two organizations and our webinar for today. We will have a great panel conversation with our three interesting and amazing panelists. Alexandra Borrow from Liwell, Zambia. She also likes to be called Alex. We have Adrian Accurate from Ilia Philanthropies and Pamela Roussos from the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And I will give you a little more introduction about them and their expertise here in a minute. We will then open up for a Q&A and then close with some interesting questions and next steps there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So Care Social Ventures, why are we here and what are we doing? So Care is an international NGO that has been in existence as a humanitarian international NGO for the last 100 years plus now, and we have offices in 93 countries. As Care Social Ventures, we do three core things for Care. The first thing is we assess the feasibility of Care as an organization and the projects within Care to become independent social businesses. We provide business support for these identified ideas in terms of building a board, helping them identify a legal structure, and then we provide capital support to help these enterprises survive and thrive, and thereby also be ready for scale. Why are we here today? I think we are here because we have quite a few companies that are last mile distributors in our portfolio, and we think that having boards, effective boards, has been very important for them, and some of them are also building in the process of building boards. So we think this is an interesting conversation for our companies, and we also find our relationship with Global Distributors Collective very enriching to learn from all the expertise and that they have gained in the sector over the last few years. I will let Emma introduce Global Distributors Collective now and the sponsor for this webinar, and then we'll go ahead from there.
Thanks, Zubaida, and we are also very pleased to be partnering with Care Social Ventures for this webinar series. Hopefully some of you caught the first webinar last week on building a board. The Global Distributors Collective, for those of you who don't know, is a collective of around 200 last mile distribution companies around the world. And we work to support last mile distributors to help them grow and reach profitability. We provide a whole range of services to our members, from training and innovation support through to information sharing, matchmaking and convening. And we also work to build a collective voice for the sector and try and raise the profile of last mile distributors and the members that we serve. So that's a little bit about the GDC. I'd just also like to tell you a little bit about who our sponsor is for today. This webinar is supported by GET.invest, which is a European program which aims to mobilise investment in decentralised renewable energy. GET.invest is supported by the EU, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands and Austria. GET.invest provide a whole range of services for last mile distributors, so I would recommend taking a look at their website, and we'll be circulating this deck after the webinar later this week, so you can take a closer look at some of the services that they offer a bit later. Thanks, Zubaida, back to you.
I was on mute there. So great. So talking about why are we here today? We are here today because having a good governance and building an effective board is really hard. And what we've seen time and again is very specifically with last mile distributors, they face a lot of issues around this, primarily because many of them are unique and they're dealing with really interesting challenges because they're trying to reach the last mile consumers. This webinar is primarily for us to bring these insights to the table from different stakeholders, primarily from the entrepreneurs themselves, people who are experienced board members who are investors on these, and also independent board members who've been there. In our last webinar, if we can move to the next slide, I think for us it was important that we set the ground in terms of what kind of board do we build, but today it's about managing that board that we build effectively. And what we're going to cover today is primarily around how do you get the most out of your board? How do you make sure that these committed individuals who are on your board, who are willing to contribute, how do you make sure that you align your interests with them and help the company move forward? We also want to make sure we talk a little bit about how do you manage these board meetings. And as and when there is CEO transitions happening from founder to CEO to bringing in experienced CEOs to run these companies, how does the board manage this transition? And finally, I think many of us know, being on the board and also as an entrepreneur, that sometimes boards end up being just a checkbox, right? We just kind of get together, talk about a few things and move on. But how do you move beyond this checkbox approach, and how do you actually make your board work for you and for your organization? I think those are the topics that we will cover today. Next slide, please. I think in terms of moving on, it is my pleasure to introduce the three panelists. Alexandra Burrow is our entrepreneur today. She's the managing director of Live Well, a last mile distribution company that is under the Care Social Ventures portfolio. She's previously worked in Article 25 at St. John Jerusalem Eye Hospital, and she's very passionate about working in Zambia and brings a lot of experience working on the ground. Our next panelist here is a seasoned investor and board member, Adrian Ackeret. He is the CFO of Elia Foundation of Ethics and Globalization. He's a philanthropic impact investor that is focused on fighting absolute poverty. He's based in Switzerland, and he's a board member of many startups and organizations at scale, which are such as Bogosphere, S-Smart, Leap, Skills, and Skiller. He has an MA in management from University of St. Gallen. Our third panelist is an independent board member. She's Pamela Roussos, who's a chief community officer at the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship at Santa Clara University. She is responsible there for building strategic partnerships and alliances that span not only Miller Center's global footprint, but also has a lot of experience working with organizations in the US. She has over 20 years of building and leading venture-backed software companies and is bringing that to the social enterprise space because of her passion for supporting and mentoring social businesses. So now we'll move on to our questions to our panelists. My first question is to Adrian and Pamela, and in that order. How do you think, Adrian, do you manage transition of a board from a checkbox board to truly a strategic organization to hold them accountable? And Pamela, if you can take on from where Adrian leaves that question.
So first of all, welcome everyone in the webinar. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for Zubaida for the introduction and for GDC and CARE to put on this webinar series. For us at Elea, we are an early stage investor, and for us, we really try to live on a partnership approach when it comes to our investments. So we see ourselves not just as a financier providing financial capital, but very much also a strategic advice, and really be at the side of the entrepreneurs to help them grow and develop their business. So for us, therefore, the question about the role of a board is really embedded in what we do. And therefore, for us, what we see and what we would like to see always when we invest in a board is that the board is really a place where strategy is being shaped. It's not just about accountability. It's not just about imposing, definitely not imposing just an investor agenda, but really trying to bring together the various perspectives and help shape and inform a strategic roadmap of the organization, particularly an early stage organization where things are fast moving, in flux, where you have to really work through a lot of issues that are happening at the same time. when I think about last mile distribution, for me, even though some of the business models as such are not necessarily complex, I still believe it is a complex environment because you work with many different dynamics at play. And I think for a board to really be effective in this environment, it is very important for the board to reflect to be able to reflect these dynamics. And I think you spoke about this in the last webinar when it comes to how to set up a board. But I think when it comes to managing a board, I think it's equally important from my perspective to really live up to that and to try to bridge the gap between having a more long-term strategic view, but really also be in tune with the operational dynamics. I think you cannot be effective in trying to bring something to the table about the long-term development when you don't understand how the things are really moving forward month by month, quarter by quarter. And so I think it is really vital for the board to be very aware that they need to bridge that gap between understanding the local context, also doing frequent visits. I mean, now currently it's difficult, but as long as it's more easily possible to really also be close to the operations, to be close to the team, and to have a reporting and a meeting rhythm, frankly, also that reflects that. So for instance, in a context like in the case of S-Mart in India, we have found that a monthly reporting rhythm is really the minimum we need in order to understand how the cycles develop. And I think for me, it really all starts about this awareness and the ability to zoom in and zoom out and to make the board a place where these discussions can take place at both of these levels, at the very long term overall level, but also zoom in, dig deeper, and be a forum where the entrepreneurs can also open up and just share what they observe, what they struggle with, and then try to bring this into context. And then I think you create a kind of a learning journey that helps this transition from a board that is just there in order to merely ensure that everyone is doing their job, that compliance is met, more towards a board that is really part of an informed, longer term, more strategic agenda.
Thank you, Adrian. Pamela, I think Adrian threw some very good insights on how do you truly shape the strategy of an organization by being close to it, by having the right kind of information to do so. How do you think we can hold the board accountable in terms of managing and shaping the strategy of an organization?
Yeah, thanks, Zubaida, and thank you all for joining us today. I think having an effective board is something that I'm very passionate about. And I think is, as entrepreneurs, basically what you have with a board, if you select the right board members, is you have free strategic advisors surrounding you, and you can make the most out of this. And so it's really important, number one, to pick the right members of your board. And the way to think about that is to say, okay, so what are all of the things about my business that's critical to get right? And as last mile distributors, all of you are training sales agents. You have to market or help your sales agents understand how to market products. So having sales and marketing expertise at the table is really important. All of you are working on razor thin margins. And so being able to have operational efficiencies in your business is critical for success. And so having someone with lived operational experience, and I think that that's an important piece here, is that you find people that think about your business holistically. What are the critical elements of getting it right, and getting people that have those lived experiences to the table with you. And that these are going to, I think it's really important to be thinking about your board as being a working board. I see a number of enterprises in general, social entrepreneurs and social enterprises as well, as having kind of celebrity board members. And those are people that are not going to work for you. You need people that are going to answer the phone when you call them, because as an entrepreneur, you're going to be constantly having something that's kind of troubling you or blowing up in your face. And so having board members that will answer the phone for you is really important. So thinking about that, and then being able to, in terms of accountability, making sure that they're going to answer the phone. I mean, making sure that they understand the expectations of being a board member before they even join your board. So understanding for yourself, what is it that you need? What are the expectations? Quarterly meetings. Adrian was just talking about, setting up a regular cadence for meetings, but then also one thing that we've done early on at Livelihoods is we identified the critical elements of the business. We found experts, and then we had those board members meet on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis, depending, with the people that were in the business running those pieces. So a board member with operational strength was meeting with the COO or the person in charge of operations. And so they were doing that. And so not only was that helping not just the CEO of the organization, but strengthening the whole organization, and your board can play a strong role in doing that. And then, as Adrian said, being connected with the business. And so, being connected with, you don't want board members being, out here. You want them to really understand your business. So when you can travel, that's that. But also one thing that we've used at Livelihoods and every year we have a longer board meeting and use it as the most significant change story, as a way of connecting in with the mission. Because again, you're all mission-driven organizations, and so we, as boards, as a board member, we need to have that touchstone of the mission. And so being able to build that into your cadence as well is an important part of accountability for your board, and having them really, again, working for you.
Pamela, that's very useful and interesting, because I think sometimes we assume that we are all aligned with the mission and we don't set that cadence to reiterate our mission over and over again. And also, I think your insights on picking the right members and setting the expectations right at the onset are very important, and having those board members with operational experience knowing what is happening and trying to understand that and being empathetic towards the challenges, I think it's very important as well. Moving on to Adrian, I think, Adrian, what do you think is the support or input that we should expect from board members, both in and out of the meetings, right? Of course, in the meetings, we're going to be presenting a lot of stuff, but what kind of support do you think an entrepreneur should expect within the boardroom, but also beyond?
Yeah, I think first of all, what Pamela mentioned, time commitment, I think that's the most important thing. Really being there according to the needs of the business and not just the wish and whim of the board member. So committing to reading the material, committing to thinking about it, committing to also reach out to the entrepreneur when something happens that the board members think is relevant for the enterprise. So it's a two-way street. I think this for me would be the number one thing, because this is the basis for actually having a relevant conversation. Then I think second, really, I think for me, it's all about having a conversation at eye level. And I think what you should expect from a board member is to really be empathetic with the entrepreneur, but not basically, this doesn't mean being uncritical. To the contrary, this is the basis for having a critically constructive relationship. But it really means that the entrepreneur can expect the board member to really understand also the tight spots that the entrepreneurs might find themselves in, and have also some sense of psychological awareness of the situation and be supportive. I think that's the most important thing. Particularly in an early stage organization, everyone's resources are always stretched, and so there is just no use in formulating the great perfect answer to everything that comes up, but being practical, being attuned to what the actual issue is, and really helping the entrepreneur find the real question. I think that's probably the most important thing that can happen in a board meeting, that you together develop what the actual issue is, as opposed to just try to find the solution based on not the most adequate analysis. And then I think lastly, what you can definitely and should expect from a board member is a certain element of network, both in a very transactional and functional aspect in terms of fundraising, in terms of having experts at hand, having a network of further potential in all dimensions of the business, but also in terms of a network of like-minded people, of opinions, of exposing someone's opinion to the business and bring in other interested people to have a view and to share their views. So I'm going to stop here, but these are the things that would come to mind first in my mind. But let me emphasize again, I think really the time commitment for me would be the #1 thing where I would start.
No, the time commitment very specifically to understand what's happening, to read the material, but also being present to evaluate the situation, I think is very important. And Adrian, I would like you to add a little bit more also from what kind of support should board members provide to individual entrepreneurs? Because I think you touched on that, right? Like entrepreneurs are so into it. How do you help them come out of it and look at the big picture? If you have a few thoughts there to add.
Yeah, I think one thing is clearly having a good rhythm for board meetings. That is always a great help because it sets expectations clearly. How frequently should you report on something, kind of giving also some space for doing something, implementing things, and basically not create the expectation that the things change the next day, but really to have that space for having a discussion, doing something, and then reporting back. I think that's in a kind of in a more longer term and routine perspective. I think that's awfully important in my mind. On the other hand, I think what is really important is also being flexible and being there when it's necessary. So for instance, when I think back what we also had to do at A-Smart a year ago, when the lockdown happened, we basically switched to a weekly and then even almost daily very brief check-in call, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. And it was also, I guess, important for the team to understand that the board would be there. If they need something, they could reach out and we could try to figure it out collectively. So these, I think, would be a few things to mention here.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I think from the board members' perspective, we'll move on to the entrepreneur's perspective. Alex, what advice do you have for managing boards, right? Like you've come a long way at LiveWell from being an idea to a project to actually transitioning into a business and the business growing successfully now. How have you managed your boards and what do you think has helped you in managing this board and transitioning through different phases of your venture?
Thanks, Zubaida, and thanks for the introduction. Lovely to meet everyone. LiveWell, as you've mentioned, Zubaida, has gone through many different sort of stages, and we are now in the stage where we're sort of ready to take off and actually stand alone as a business. And many people would probably think, oh, do you need a different type of board for that, or different types of people? When I first arrived 3 years ago, I will be honest, our board meetings were 4 to 5 hours long. There was lots of different opinions around the table about business versus impact, what should come first, the usual debates. And it's very hard to be able to manage expectations. I think from my perspective, what I've done is I've learned to listen. Adrian, you picked up on something there about criticism. I've learned to kind of grow quite in around those different opinions and how to also manage board expectations. It's really vital that you know what you want from your board, but also what the board is expecting from you as either a CEO, managing director, whether you're transitioning from being a founder into a CEO. These are different expectations. And I think you need to make sure that you're able to be honest. Also, limit the actual length of the board meeting. So we went from fairly sort of chaotic, nearly 4 or 5 hour ones. We now have very much streamlined ours. And I found that I will have external conversations with my board members between board meetings, and where relevant, obviously include everyone in emails, communication, etc. but it's okay to have an individual conversation with that particular board member. Pamela, you pointed out about having particular board members for specific things. Last year, we realized we needed support on finance and making sure our books were okay, etc. So we brought in somebody who works for a big financial firm, you know, and it's okay to have individual conversations. And I think sometimes people are quite afraid, like, oh, if I talk to them, are they going to get upset on this side, etc. I think also there's a different, I've always had my chairman also be, say, in America or actually in country. So for me, that's also been another shift as well. With COVID, Adrian, you brought on the fact that your board met like instantly. We also did the same nearly 2 years ago. We flipped from like, right, how are we going to go from money making, last mile distribution to making COVID worse with our sales agents. I got straight on with my board, convened a meeting, gave them 3 different scenarios about money, cash flow, sales, what we could do within the confines of Zambia, what the ministry were allowing, what they weren't allowing. If there was going to be a lockdown, how would that affect LiveWell? So I think communication is key, and don't be afraid to ask your board questions either as a group or individually.
Great, Alex. I think it's a very interesting point that many founders or entrepreneurs are scared of the board. And that goes back to Pamela's point of having that celebrity board where you're wondering what they will think all the time. Just an add-on question to you, Alex, there in terms of how do you manage different types of stakeholders on your board who have very different interests and perspectives that they bring to the table, right? One of the strategies you mentioned is like having individual conversations, but also in a board meeting, I think it becomes very difficult when they bring different perspectives and interests. How do you manage that as an entrepreneur?
I think from my perspective, what I make sure that I do is that I'm presenting everything that I know my board would want to hear and to touch upon. So I don't get bogged down into the day-to-day operations, like right down into it. I stick to like the KPIs, so key impacts that LiveWell, you know, reports on a monthly basis. I make sure that we talk a lot about sales, so the money-making side, but then I will also reflect on the impact side. And I don't go too heavy on either, because I know a lot of my board members are, I'll be making money today, and the other half are, what's the impact that LiveWell is showing? So for me, it's very much clear in my presentation that half of it will be about sales and business, and the other half will be impact driven and how we are showing that we are improving livelihoods of underserved people in Zambia.
Great, thank you, Alex. I think that brings us to the next question, and Pamela, it'd be great if you can answer that for us, is in terms of succession planning. Last mile distribution companies, like Alex mentioned, transition from being an idea to founder based, to the founder transitioning to a CEO or not, and then having newer CEOs as we move towards scale. How does a last mile distribution company manage this transition? How can the board help in that transition process?
Yeah, so, you know, succession planning is often forgotten about, and it is one of the primary things the board is there to do. I mean, a board is there at the end of the day to manage risk and help the organization be successful, and succession planning is a big piece of that. No one's going to be there forever, and we need to be thinking about that. So and we went through that process at Livelihoods. The first CEO, Maria Springer, decided that she wanted to go back to school, and so we basically appointed her co-founder, Tanya Layden, to be that next CEO. And Tanya had been the COO, and so she really understood the business and what was going on the ground. She was in Nairobi, so Livelihoods is last mile distribution in Kenya. But she hadn't been a CEO. So as a board chair, and one thing that I should also mention, you know, we were talking about time and the amount of time that board members need to dedicate to all of your organizations, is that as board chair, actually, I have weekly meetings with Tanya now, and I have for the last many years. I've been the board chair for the last 8 years now. And we have weekly meetings. Now, doesn't happen every week. Obviously, she's traveling, I'm traveling, but it's on the calendar. And as leaders of your organization, you have a right to ask for that if that's what you want and that's what you need. So through that transition, I spent a lot of time with Tanya in terms of helping her understand what it means to lead an organization versus be in the organization and do the day-to-day, and how to then grow the next layer of management. And now we have Tanya's very hands-off, and the people that are running the organization, you got Finn and Joseph and Alex, and they were at Livelihoods at the very beginning in 2011, and now they are leading the organization. So it really is about supporting as board members, supporting the leadership development, helping new people coming in to understand how they can lead an organization and bring that next level of management up, because again, they're going to leave. And so as a board, it's constantly thinking about succession planning and how we're going to get that next layer of leadership to the place where they can rightly and effectively lead. So
that's great, Pamela. I think we don't ever think of boards as an entity to help plan succession, and that's so important. Adrian, moving on from Pamela to you, as an investor on the board, how do you help? How do you look at such transitions, and how do you help as a board member for that?
No, I think I totally would like to totally echo what Pamela said. I think from an investor perspective, I think it first of all starts with this being a crucial element of an investment risk, having a visibility of not being dependent on any one individual person. I mean, after all, in an early stage environment, you always bet on the team. 50% or more of the investment is always about whether or not you believe in the team being able to pull it off. But I think when it comes to succession, that is a very, very important aspect. It is not just an individual person and his or her hat. It is really about alignment of a team and of a leadership constellation. And so what we as an investor and as an organization that runs a portfolio try to do is try to help organizations understand that this is really about leadership values as much as leadership in a transactional sense, someone being being kind of appointed for a very specific function. It's really about developing a set of values and principles that guide the leadership of the whole organization. And where we believe we can contribute to that process because many of our portfolio organizations share similar challenges there. And also some of kind of the leaders in ELEA, our chairman, other board members have real experience in that process as well that we can bring to the table. And I think the important thing is to see this as an opportunity as well for the organization in a wider sense, not just for the leadership team, but also for the team as a whole. In the development of an organization, at some point, we would always believe it's very important to have something like leadership values, leadership principles that are defined, that are talked about, that are lived, and that are somehow tangible to a wider set of the team. And in a last mile environment, it is a very people-intensive business. It's a sales organization. You interact with so many stakeholders. And so I would say it is a very challenging thing to happen, to have these transitions, but it can also be a real opportunity to focus on this and to embed this in a wider development of the team. And so, for instance, A-Smart is an organization that has gone through several of these transitions in a relatively harmonious way, because they started as basically a 5-person co-founder team and have now realigned their roles in several iterations. And the last iteration, a bit over a year ago, in that sense, was not something that came as a shock to the organization. And that's something that I would say we were able to accompany as a board and embed in this broader development of the team overall.
That is great, Adrian. Thank you so much. I think it's so important for us to plan transitions. We all know that business is uncertain, and so is life. And as an entrepreneur, when I started my life about 13 years ago, the first thing I was told was, if you were to build a business, think of it as if, God forbid, you would be run over by a bus. Who's going to take your vision forward, right? Like, start planning for who is your next succession holder in the organization, as if your organization was big and successful, and start then. And I think it was such an important lesson to learn as an entrepreneur, and having a board to help you through that process is really the most biggest asset you can have. So for now, what we'll do is we'll open up to questions. I know we have a few questions on the chat. You are open to, I can ask the questions on your behalf, but you can also unmute and ask the question. I have one question from Andrew Lema. Andrew, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Andrew? I'm not sure if he's still around, but Andrew's question is, what are some pointers that an early stage startup should look at when you are looking for an independent board member? Pamela, would you like to take that question?
Is that, I'm assuming that means sourcing of potential board members? Is that how you're? I
think it is sourcing, but he might also be meaning in terms of maybe expertise as well.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, I spoke about this earlier in terms of expertise and thinking about what are the critical elements of your business that need to be able to function smoothly, and being able to then target people with that kind of expertise. So I think, like I said, last mile distribution, very much sales and marketing heavy. So having people with experience around the table, the virtual table, that has that kind of expertise. Operational success is critical. So those are all aspects of the business to getting the right positions. Understand what kind of skills and such that you're looking for. That is something too, managing a board. I mean, I think, you should have your list of what is it that's critical for me, and then be able to then target that. So I see, Andrew, you also meant in terms of sourcing. So, I think going to your network obviously is a first place to go, which is understanding, who do you know, or asking people that that, can they introduce you, or do they know someone with operational success or operational expertise, or whatever expertise you're looking for is important. So being able to tap into your network, go into others' networks. And I would say, with livelihoods, that's what we first did when our first board. I mean, and I saw there was a question about friends and family. I mean, most social enterprises start out with friends and family on the board. And the question, and so at that time, the friends and family on the livelihoods board was not really working for the organization. And so we had to transform that, and we just tapped right into our existing networks. But we knew that we wanted more diversity on the board. We knew that in terms of experience, in terms of geography, we had only one person that was in Kenya on the first functioning board. We wanted more expertise on the ground. So board building, my point is, board building is a constant process. It's not a one and done. And so we started out with one board, and we've transitioned into now a different board. And again, it's going to transition again. So you need to be thinking about that as a constant process. And as you meet interesting people, you think they can be relevant, start cultivating those relationships, because then, maybe in a month, maybe in a year, you're asking them to be a board member. So constantly be thinking you're always recruiting. You're always recruiting staff as leaders of your organization, and you're always recruiting board members.
Thank you, Pamela. You also answered the question from Prosper, which is, should we start with family and friends on the board, which I think is a very interesting question. I think the next question we have from Binayak Acharya is around, what is the average time that any board member should actually commit to? And Alex, there is a question for you. which is how many times a year does your board meet and how long do your board meetings last?
Yeah, so to answer that one directly, my board meet 3 times a year, so every quarter. We have 2 meetings which are 2.5 hours long. And then we used to have, before COVID, a day-long face-to-face where the board members who are not here in Zambia would actually come to Zambia and we would have the whole day together. We've now, because of COVID, we've actually split that out into 2 sessions. So we have, I think it was about 3.5 hours on one day and then 3.5 hours on another day. That tends to be in December because our year runs January to December. So we basically try to report in that face-to-face one or split up one because of COVID on everything that's happened in the year. I would, from my experience, I would try and limit it to 2.5 hours. It's a tall order, I know, at the beginning, because everyone probably wants to have their say and ideas and suggestions. But for me, it took a while to go from the sort of crazy 4 hours to get to the 2.5 hours. So again, if you can manage those expectations and start it off at 2.5 hours, you will be a better CEO or MD or whatever for it. I don't mind admitting to everyone here, I used to dread my board meetings. Now I actually genuinely look forward to them. I look forward to the advice, information, the flow of information going both ways. But again, it's taken me a while to get to that point. So if you can try and manage expectations from the beginning, you will be happier and wiser for it.
And what is your board member time duration commitment, Alex? What is the average time?
For me, I meet with my board chair every 2 weeks. We have an hour operations meeting, just me and the board chair. And then we have also every 2 weeks with the board chair a financial call, which is for an hour with my finance team. So I guess from the board chair's perspective, that's 2 hours plus a meeting every quarter. Plus also I'm lucky that my board chair is involved, hands-on, under the wing of Care Social Ventures. So I get external support and they're available to me pretty much when I like, which is rare, but very fortunate. I then also have other board members in country who are actually signatories on my accounts and on like payments and stuff because my board chair is external. So for me, those board members will probably spend a bit more time with me. I would suggest maybe an hour, half an hour to an hour a week. Which again is a good thing. It's another chance to kind of glean more information or advice or ask questions. I would safely say there's probably not a day that goes by where I don't speak to one board member, either on the phone or Zoom. But I'm happy with that because I've got a good interactive board.
Got it. Thanks, Alex. Adrian, what do you think is the average length of a board member? Like how many years should a board member commit to a board? I think that's one of the questions we have here.
So you mean kind of tenure of the board? Yes,
tenure of the board.
Well, I would say, I mean, if you onboard a board member who is not willing to do this for 2 years, I think it's probably not working out because you need to understand the business and so on. Whether or not this works out in the end is an open question. But for me, I think that's where I would ask serious questions if you plan to have a board and members would not be willing to commit for at least 2 years. That would be my starting position. You can always have exceptions. You can have someone who you need desperately for a very particular reason. Maybe that can be a shorter engagement. But really, if you want to have a cohesive board, it just takes time for the group to come together. And I think there is also a very important element about the size of the board. I think a board should never be too big. I think there is probably not too many reasons why you should have more than 5 to 7 people on a real functioning board. If you need to have a wider net, I would always suggest to have an advisory board of sorts, a circle of advisors. Maybe you have an engagement once a year when you bring everyone together, have a touch point with everyone. But I think it's very important not to have a bloated board. And then by implication, this means everyone has to do their fair share, but you can also have a fairly cohesive discussion.
Great. I think we have one more question around typical compensation packages for the board members. Do any of you have insights on that?
Give them hugs and love, and thank them profusely, and connect them to the mission and help them feel really good about the mission. Because at the end of the day, that's what board members for social enterprises are there to do, is support you to be successful in your business. And the important part of your business is the impact, right? And so really at the end of the day, that's what they're there for. And that's the compensation to them. Similar, if you've got mentors and such that you surround yourself with, which I highly recommend. Again, they're doing it because they want for you and your organization to be successful. And so, you can't minimize that. And that's really super important.
I think we have one more question that talks about, are you familiar with policy governance boards? I'm not sure what that question means, Charles, but if any of you want to talk about policy governance on boards, if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I just to clarify, a lot of the discussion here is so far, but boards being very, very active within the organization and being a specialization with a policy governance where the board sets different policies for the CEO to follow and basically is outwardly looking and they're not involved in the day-to-day operations. I was just curious about that. The other kind of related question I had to this was that we are undergoing a transition. We will be, but I've been in my position now for nearly 20 years and realizing that for the sustainability of the organization, I need to move on. But there is no number 2, number 3 to take over my position. I have staff, but certainly no one to take over the position. So I guess twofold question. I throw them in there. Just curious if you do. We're policy governance. If you had any suggestions on someone like myself who's been there for a long time, of how to transition out of one's position. I'll mute.
Thank you, Charles.
I could throw in like a sentence or two for you, Charles, on this one. My board have been very, even since I arrived, it talks about succession, and they have really pushed for me to have a number 2 involved in the organization, to the point where we've had, debates on it and kind of nearly like, why haven't you found someone? What are you doing about it? We just want to hear about that. So for me, you've mentioned that you've got staff, etc. Within LiveWell, for my organization, I've always found it really important to promote within. Again, that's up to other people, but if you've surrounded yourself with people who believe in the vision and the mission of the organization, if it takes a bit of training to find that number 2, which is what I'm doing even at the moment, that's okay. So that would just be my 2 pennies worth on that side of things. But I'm sure Pamela might have more experience on the governance policy.
So all of the organizations, and at Miller Center, we've worked with over 1,200 social enterprises globally. And what we've seen is that, again, so these are organizations that are kind of in the early stage, so post-revenue, early growth stages, and having an active board is the right thing for them. Now, and as organizations, as you grow, there is a point where you don't necessarily have as much of an active board in the day-to-day, right? There is a line between management and governance, but in the early days, that line is very blurry, right? Because as social entrepreneurs, you don't have big organizations. You need these resources to support you, to guide you. And so having them being active has been a really important thing with the social enterprises that we've worked with. So I'm not sure if the hands-off approach is working for you, Charles, and
yeah, it did. It
okay.
really helped in the evolution. We had a professional advisory board that provided that really hands-on coaching me in the early in the early stage and stuff, but it became a point where each board meeting turned to this going into the weeds of issues that was like, yeah. And so when we transitioned this policy governance, oh my gosh, just night and day difference for me as a CEO to manage my operation, have very clear divisions of that's not related to you. You have one employee, that's me. I have these very delegated things, and I could transition that down to my staff and say, I don't need to know all these things. I'm responsible, but I don't need to have all that detailed information. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, having there is a line between management and governance, and having your board members in the weeds, in your business, like doing the day-to-day, that, as a leader, you have every right to say, hold on, thank you for your thoughts, but that's not that's not your highest and best use, right? Your highest and best use to me and the organization is here. And so, directing them to focus and such, because like I said, sometimes it is easy for people to get into the weeds. The other thing I wanted to circle back around was a point that Alex made, which is, you have your board meetings, and however often you do it, it sounds like we're all used to quarterly meetings. But you have board meetings before the board meetings. As Alex was saying, you're talking to your board members ahead. Well, you really are trying, as a leader of the organization, trying to minimize any surprises to happen in the boardroom, right? And so for you to be thinking ahead, to think, okay, so who, this is something that we're going to be talking about, who's going to have some issues, who's going to have some pushback on this, so that you're working with them ahead of the meeting to understand their issues and work with them and such, so that, again, those surprises don't show up in the boardroom. Now, or surprises will, but you should be very cognizant of working those things ahead, as Alex was talking about.
Sure, we have 5 minutes left, Pamela. Thank you. I want to make sure we address some questions from our participants who posted questions before the webinar as well. And one of the important questions from there is, how do you set targets for your board? And also, how do you manage the fear of board members in taking risks? If we can take about 30 seconds, if one of you can answer those questions for us.
So I'm not sure if an early stage board regularly sets targets for itself, but what I would recommend is that you have a regular session where you reflect on whether the board is actually doing its job. So I would advocate doing this once a year, taking 30 minutes, 40 minutes, going around the table and have an honest conversation. What do we think we did well? What do we think we need to improve on as a group? And I think that can go a very long way.
Great, thank you so much, Adrian. I think we want to take 30 seconds from each of the panelists to have one recommendation that you would give to last mile distribution companies in managing their board for success. Adrian, you want to go first?
Yeah, I would say have a cohesive, not too big board, and make sure that every board member really spends at least one day at the operations, with the operations, before they really become a board member, and refresh that regularly.
Thank you, Adrian. Pamela, do you want to go next?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think having the right board members at the table and being mindful about how the needs of your business are going to change over time, and constantly reflecting and making sure that that's happening at the board level in addition to your operations is critical, and really connecting their board to the work so that they, like I said, that's why they're there, is the impact. And so making sure that connection is deep and strong, and you'll get as much as you can out of them.
Alex?
Yeah, mine's fairly similar to Pamela's, but mine would be have people around you who support your vision as an individual in relation to the activities of the organization that you have either founded, you're running, you've been brought in as the CEO to run. So as well as the organization's vision, that's imperative. Otherwise, you will spend your time clashing heads. So people who have like-minded visions and support what you want to achieve as well as the organization.
Sounds good. Great. Thank you so much. I think we're right about winding up our session here today. We are definitely looking forward to hearing from any of you who are interested in finding a board position, or any of you who are looking for board members. Please let us know, and we'd be happy to help you find those board members or help you find positions on boards. We have a quick feedback poll here. If you don't mind giving us your feedback, I think we would really appreciate it. I hope all of you can see the poll here. And finally, I just want to let you know that thank you all for joining. A very huge thank you to Emma and GDC, to Adrian, to Alex, and to Pamela for joining and making this a huge success. I think this is such an important conversation that we've unlocked, and we've heard some amazing things about what people learned from it, and how many people approaching us for board member positions after our first webinar. I hope the second one was useful as well. We are hoping that in the next few weeks here, we will have a blog that we would bring out as CARE Social Ventures and GDC in summarizing these two conversations, which will hopefully help a much wider audience than the audience that attended the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, thank you, Adrian, Pamela, and Alex, for sparing your time here to help us understand managing boards and everything that we can do to make last mile distribution companies a success by choosing the right board and managing them really well. Thank you, everybody. And here we are absolutely at time, and we are looking forward to staying connected and hearing about board member experiences and needs going forward.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.